Hi, I'm Dave, and this is my garage. This is my 1983 Porsche 944, naturally aspirated. It does have an issue. I'm guessing it's a head gasket. There's lots of coolant in the oil, and it's all muddy. It does run. It runs, okay, but it's been sitting for 10 years. But anyway, with 209,000 miles on it, I think it's due for a rebuild, and that's what I plan on doing. To do that, first step one is to remove the engine. And for this, I'm going to use the Clark's Garage instructions, and they're awesome. I'm glad that that's out there. I really appreciate that resource, and of course, anybody who has 944 probably already knows about the Clark's Garage website. Quick thing: I'm not a mechanic, and I've never done this before. I've removed an engine before in a Honda one time. That was difficult enough, but it was not that bad in hindsight. So I'm going to hope that this isn't so bad either. Once I remove it, I'll try my hand at rebuilding it. So first thing I'm going to do is remove the engine. All right.
Step 1. Remove the fuse for the fuel pump. In my 83, the fuse panel is underneath the dash, and the fuse is the red one in my case, the second one on the left. Step 2. Try to start the car. Step 3. Remove the battery. And push the positive cables through the holes in the firewall. The terminal head will have to be removed for this. Step 4 is the disconnecting of the DME control unit, which is outlined in DME 01. The first step of that is disconnecting the battery, which is already done. The DME control unit on my car is under the driver's side dash. The next step is to disconnect the DME control cable from the DME. There are some clips on one side. You release that and it pivots off. Step 5 is to cut the tie wraps that hold the battery cable to the firewall. In my case, there are 5 tie wraps. I also disconnected one of the connectors. For step 6, you're to pull the DME control cable with the connector through the firewall. In order to do that, there were some things that were tie wrapped to the cable. I had to remove those along with that tie wrap right there. The grommet in the firewall pops into the engine compartment. I had mistakenly pushed it into the car, which I had to then push it back out. Step 7 refers to AF01 to remove the air filter housing and the airflow sensor. In my case, the airflow housing was already gone, and I just needed to remove the airflow sensor. I had to use a jeweler's screwdriver to get that clip removed from that connector. Step 8 refers to a turbo model, which doesn't refer to me. Step 9 refers to IGN01 to remove the distributor cap rotor and the dust cap. The IGN01 procedure has you go through and mark the screw on the distributor cap so you know how far to turn it to release it. I actually did this, but it didn't video well, so I left it out. I had to turn the crank so that the screw on the rotor would face the top to access. Getting this rotor off was very difficult. I tried to use the Allen wrench to get it off. I used a 1/8 and a 3mm. Neither worked, and it was just a real pain. I ended up having just to break it. Step 10 through 12 have you remove the wheels and put it on jack stands, which I had already done before I started. Step 13 has you remove the skid or the belly pans from underneath the car. I didn't see anything under here, so as far as I know, it's already been removed. Step 14 refers to Cool 04 to remove the radiator. A sub-process of this is Cool 02, which has you drain the radiator first. There's a lot of good information in there, but for me, all I did was just pull the drain plug. After draining the radiator, the next step is to cut the straps and remove 3 bolts that hold the fan assembly to the upper radiator support. The only tie wraps I saw were 2 that were holding a hose in place. I cut the straps, but I couldn't find the 3 bolts. I mistook those 3 bolts for the 2 bolts, the jam nuts that hold the radiator in, here and here. This wasn't part of the procedure, but I wanted to get this bracket out of the way. It normally holds the air filter housing, and I just want to get it out of the way. It's held on by 3 bolts, and it also holds a hose bracket that also needs to be removed. Here I am trying to remove the hose bracket. I'm finding that a lot of these nuts are rusted on, and they're kind of difficult to get off. I guess it's a consequence of having an old car that's been sitting too long. Again, this isn't part of the procedure. I just want to get this bracket out of the way. In this shot, I'm actually removing the locking nuts that hold the radiator in place. I was mistaken, and I thought this had something to do with the fan shroud. If you're following along with the procedure, this is Cool 04 Step 4, which removes the 3 bolts at the bottom and the tie wraps, which are here. There's a clip here, and another tie wrap here, and another clip here.
I'm going to unclip this. Put this one over here. Pop this out. That pops out like that. And this one also pop out. That's loose. I'll see if this can pop out. That just pulls out like that. It pulls out like that.
With that harness out of the way, now I could remove those 3 bolts. Once I removed those 3 bolts at the bottom of the fan assembly, I realized that the 3 bolts on the top were actually hidden by that hose. So I just went to remove the hose. It's not part of the procedure, but I just did it anyway.
Also do
With that hose out of the way, now I can access those 3 upper bolts that attach the fan assembly to the radiator. Since I've already removed those jam nuts, the next step for me is to unplug the thermofan switch. The next step is to disconnect all the radiator hoses. I'm starting with the lower hose. There are 2 hoses at the top. One's for the engine and one's for the overflow. To remove the radiator, you must first push up on the bottom of the radiator to disengage it from the rubber mounts. Then pull the bottom of the radiator towards the rear of the car and lower it out. Removing the lower radiator hose. I don't think this was on the procedure either, but this is removing the intake J-boot. For step 16, the first thing I did was to remove the connector for the throttle position sensor. There's the connector underneath there that removed, and those other connectors that are sitting there on that cable are part of the airflow sensor. Also on the harness are a couple of wires that come down to, I think this is the oil pressure sensor underneath the oil filter. There's another connector right under the manifold right there. I'll disconnect. And another by the driver's side firewall. I removed the spark plug wires and the distributor cap to make it easier to remove the rest of the harness when step 16. In step 17, you need to remove the throttle cable. It's pretty easy to do. Step 18 is to disconnect the brake booster vacuum hose. I had trouble just removing the hose from that nipple where the clamp is, so I went back a little further on it and just removed everything right out of the brake booster itself. That hose from the brake booster curls around and goes into the intake manifold. It is connected by this Y connector and held on by this clamp right here. I'm going to remove that. It's hard to see here, but I also popped out the little clip that holds the harness of wires for the alternator. Now with that clip disconnected, I can just pull this hose out of the intake manifold. While I was here in the area, I just wanted to remove this bracket here and the hoses that are attached to it. This is actually step 29. It has to do with the AC fast idle switch or fast idle hose, and there's just a couple of clamps on it, and I removed the bracket. I'm disconnecting a hose clamp there. It's out of view behind that bracket. The other end of the hose wasn't connected, so I'll have to figure that out later. Another thing to note too is I'm labeling all these hoses as I go along. I don't show that on video so much, but they're there. Alright, around here is where I started going a little bit out of order with the process. This is actually step 19, which is removing the ground strap to the back of the firewall. Step 21, remove the starter. I couldn't get my socket on this bolt, or even a closed-in wrench, so I had to use an open-end wrench for it. And while in the area, just remove the clutch slave cylinder. It's a later step, which is step 35, but you're already under the car and it's right there, so it seems like the right thing to do. I used a small bungee to tie back the slave cylinder best I could. Step 25 has you remove the coolant hose from the heater valve. At this point, I still haven't completely removed the harness, so I had to label and remove these flywheel sensors to get to the coolant hose below it. Step 26 is to remove the heater return hose. Back to harness removal, I disconnect the alternator wires. With the alternator disconnected, I can now remove one of the harnesses. Step 28 is to remove the vacuum lines to the vent valve and the thermal valve at the back of the engine. The thermal valve is underneath the intake manifold. You can't really see it here, but it's kind of like a bunny ear looking thing. I label and remove the other end. Step 30 is to remove the charcoal vent hose. I believe mine has already been removed. It's not there. I think it goes from here to there to that white nipple. I'm not 100% sure that's true or not. Just looks like it goes there. I'd also like to figure out if this cluster of stuff here is necessary. I'd love to simplify it. Continuing with the harness removal, I disconnect the fuel injectors. Okay, one of the last things that's holding the harness on is this clip here. I guess technically it's not a clip. I don't know what it's called, but it's a rubber fastener of some kind that it's got a 13 millimeter bolt that holds the harness. Well, I guess I lied. There's two more ground bolts that are holding onto it. These were hiding right under that clip fastener thing. And there was also a wire that goes down to the oxygen sensor. It looked like it was a something that could be disconnected, but when I tried, it just crumbled and broke in my hand. So I had to unbolt it where it was connected to the firewall. Now with the harness completely removed, I'm going to move on to step 31, which is disconnecting the fuel lines. Here I'm removing a hose that I hadn't removed earlier. This one has that metal T connected to it. The other end of that hose led to this thing here on the driver's side firewall close to the charcoal canister. This is step 23, removing the bracket for the clutch slave cylinder. It's under the intake manifold close to the oil fill tube. Here I'm removing the small vacuum lines going to the fuel regulators, and when I pulled this out, it actually broke on me. Step 32, attach the engine hoist. I had trouble with removing the O2 sensor. It was rusted on really good. I don't know if it's ever been off. And since it was already damaged from above with the connector, I just moved on to step 34, which is removing the exhaust system. In this shot, I am removing the 6 bolts that disconnect the exhaust from the exhaust manifold. I disconnected the rest of the hangers that connected the exhaust system. There's 2 bolts in front of the catalytic converter, 2 after the catalytic converter, and 2 at the muffler. This is the exhaust system as it came out. 35 is to unbolt the slave cylinder, which I did in a previous step when I removed the starter. Here is step 36, which is to remove the right side motor mount shield. The next step is to remove the alternator. I didn't realize this, but the alternator is in a fixed spot, which is different than any other car I've worked on. The belt is actually tightened with the AC compressor, not the alternator, which I didn't realize. So the bolt I loosened that was underneath the alternator actually went to the AC compressor, and it didn't move. So I eventually just cut the belt and tried to go from there. So after the belt was cut, I just thought it was really tight, but in reality there was another bolt underneath that I didn't realize till later. The bolt was in a really tight spot that you can only access it through the wheel well. I couldn't remove the bolt completely because it was just in such a tight spot, but I could loosen it to a point where I could remove the alternator. Step 38 is to remove the front stabilizer or the sway bar. There are 2 bolts that attach to the lower control arm. Then another 2 bolts held on to a bracket. The same bolts on the left side were removed as well. I just didn't video it. Step 39 is to unbolt and pull aside the AC compressor. In my case, I'm just going to remove it because I know the AC has been discharged for a long time. I'm now removing the adjuster that would loosen or tighten the AC and alternator belt. I disconnect the AC lines and then remove the compressor. Here you can see that small alternator bolt that was tight in there and it wouldn't come out until I removed the AC compressor. Step 40 is to disconnect the torque tube. There's 4 bolts holding it on and they're all very tight. I got 3 of them off. 1 of them rung off on me. I had to use another wrench as a breaker bar. Step 40 is to remove the tie rod ends. Here's another lesson learned here with this tie rod end. The only other car that I had done this on was a Honda, which you give it a couple of whacks with a hammer and it pops right out. Not so with the Porsche. I ended up destroying the threads of the tie rod end, so I'm going to have to replace it, which I really should do anyway. So the right way to do this is with a ball joint separator. Live and learn. Next is to remove the steering shaft. I did put an alignment mark on there, but I don't think it really matters since I'm going to be replacing it. At least hope it doesn't matter. Anyway, step 43 is to remove the shaft. This by far is the most difficult part of the whole process for me. Even after soaking this thing with some PB Blaster and applying some heat to it, I had to pound on this thing for about 2 hours. I don't know how you would get this off without destroying it. Luckily, I needed to replace it anyway, but I really had to beat this thing up. Eventually, I used an air hammer on it, and that helped a bit, but it was still very difficult to get off. I say air hammer, but it's probably like an air chisel. This steering shaft is really the reason why it was parked in the first place. The U-joint had failed an inspection, and because it's really loose, and at the time I didn't have a garage and really wasn't up for the task. For steps 44 and 45, we're removing the lower control arm. First is to remove the two bolts that go to the chassis and the cross member here. And for 45, it's to remove the suspension ball joint from the lower control arm. Now, there's three bolts that connect that ball joint, and instead of disconnecting the ball joint at those three bolts, which I had a hard time getting to anyway, I just removed the ball joint and the control arm all at one. I used the ball joint separator to push it out. I couldn't get any video of this because it was too tight of a spot to get a camera and a light in there. It didn't specifically state to drain the oil, but I thought this would be a good time as any to do it. Notice how watery it is. The next step is to remove the bolts for the motor mounts. And this is the right side motor mount that's tucked under the exhaust manifold. I couldn't really get any video of removing it because it's so tight in there. This is where the ratcheting wrenches really came in handy, since my sockets wouldn't fit. The left side motor mount was no problem. Step 47 is to support the cross member with a jack and a block of wood. Cross member, dumbass, that's an oil pan. Step 48, with the engine supported from above with the engine hoist, you need to remove the 4 bolts that hold the cross member in place. These are, I think, 19mm bolts, and I needed a breaker bar to get them loose. I only shot video for removing the bolts on the right side, but they're the same on the left. Next, the cross member is lowered out with the steering rack attached. For step 50, you want to slide the engine off of that torque tube spline and just lower it down out of the car. There seemed to me that there was like a sweet spot of how high or low, or maybe the angle of the engine, where that slid out easily. I did use a pry bar to help separate the bell housing from the torque tube. I had to move the engine as far forward as I could possibly get it, and just to get it off of that spline. It wasn't that hard, but it really did take some maneuvering. From there, all I had to do was jack the car up and slide the engine out. I did have to buy a taller set of jack stands for this, and according to Clark's Garage, it needs to go up at least 21 inches. I don't know exactly where that's marked. I just raised it up high enough and pulled it out. The engine was slid out on a rubber mat that I had laid out before I started. Well, I hope this helps somebody. Thanks, Clark's Garage, and thank you for watching.